I thought that Selena had introduced herself so well through her research, to be honest. You know, if you don't know, she's worked at the BFI, she co-founded the Club des Femmes, and of course Julia Wieger, being the co-director of the exhibition, the film. But Samia, are you okay over there on that seat? Samia is somebody I've been gifted with as a co-worker. She's an artist, she's a designer, she's a curator, and I like to put a slash next to each of these names and end on the word activist, because this is something that I think shapes all the other things that you've been doing. And she began working with something called the Women of Color Index, so I'm introducing yet another archive into this conversation here, just in 2016. So in a sense, the whole methodology of working through an archive is something quite new to Samia, but something she's definitely run with in the last year or so. Her first project was called Art, Sexism, Racism, Resistance, ASRR, and it established the Women of Color Index files as an activist space. And I think that's something that should be kind of, I think that what film and these different presentations on feminist archives seems to reiterate, and that might be a question to throw out to the audience, actually, whether you feel the same way. Samia has worked by inviting activists into to work with the Women of Color Index, not really work with, to share, for you to share it with, because this Women of Color Index is nothing but a file of papers, really, and it's very much that whole thing about the seeing the papers that were being unfolded so beautifully, well, just sort of piled up on each other, and just enough time to kind of clock them, but not read them, but absorb them in a kind of affective way. Samia's invited activists like Zita Holborn and somebody who calls herself Little Indian, so obvious resonances there, to dialogue with the items in these artist files. And this has led to the co-founding of something called the Women of Color Reading Group. And I'm going into detail here because this is a kind of different way of approaching the archive, which, if you've ever worked in one, is instantly and overwhelming and kind of, once it's cataloged, it doesn't get any less sort of manageable. And we need to sort of not miss and to be able to sort of go into these collections with the same kind of subtle unpacking that Julia and Nina achieved with their work. Samia was working with, established the reading group with artist lecturers at Goldsmiths. She met Michelle Gamaker-Williams and Rahana Zaman. And so from regular meetings at Goldsmiths, this reading group has since been invited to present at arts venues. So it's taking this whole way of working and this reading of the archive into completely different spaces, in a sense that the film that Julia and Nina have created has also done. So I think I have a little dopey little performance thing, and I know I'm taking up a lot of time, but this is something that I want to bring the archive into this space. It's again a moment of affect, and and I'm very lucky to be able to do it, but I need two hands because all archives need more than one hand. So this is something that, and now we've got a bit of a collective here. Well, let Samia do it actually, because we work together. Okay. I've always wanted to do this. I don't think we can sit, actually. All right. So, this is something I do time and time again in the Women's Art Library. Nina Höchtel left me this folded up thing, and I introduce the way feminist archives get unpacked or presented in different ways to different groups of people with different experiences of archives. And I say, This was left by somebody called Nina Hertel, who also left me a Mexican wrestling suit in a gold box, but that's another story. And then I start to unfold it, and I said, she's on the board of a society on women artists, a bit like this Women's International Art Club that I have in the Women's Art Library. And she's left this as a kind of invitation to research. So all I can say when I unfold this thing, I say, nobody knows who 18 of these people are. They only know a little bit, well, they know quite a bit actually, of just the two. They can only identify 2 of these women. And as you know, having watched the film, that this photograph actually encapsulates a lot of what is problematic and what is challenging about not just this particular feminist well, it's not a feminist archive, but an archive that we must adopt as a feminist project. Anyway, maybe I should stop rambling now. But this is kind of I think part of the work is to repeat it, or this is a way of bringing the archive into a kind of physical space as well. And all of these things are incredibly important, which is why I'm very grateful that you kept asking about the affect. You know, what is the affect? And you obviously demonstrated it with the scans of the images and everything else. I don't know, I mean, is that something that inspires the research as much as the making of a film?
The thing is that when we first opened the archive of the VBKÖ, we did not know the extent of the history, or we did not really know the details. And what happens to you then is that you open the boxes without any preparation of what you are going to meet. And what we met was lots of stuff in between, interesting things, you know, in between like a very old feminist history. We met documents from National Socialist times, and that was a very emotional, or that was a moment that affected us in a way. And in that sense, yes. And I think that was what actually drove us, not in the first place to make a film, but what drove us to start to work more with the archive and to think about how we as an artist organization could actually deal with our own history.
I think for me, the reason why I decided to do this PhD was because I co-set up Club de Femme in 2007, but I sort of felt at that time when I set that up with my friend Sarah that it was a kind of a vacuum in terms of I didn't really know my own sort of community and history of queer feminist film curating as kind of activism. And the more time that went on with Club de Femme and the more events that we were doing, I became much more curious about that time before. And I always knew that there was amazing programming going on here at the Rio because Charles Rubinstein, who used to be the programmer here, always told me. And I would always kept that in the back of my mind. So I think for me to have come into this archive and to see this material, it's just filled me with such joy and excitement and kind of love and a feeling of, of courage for these women at that time to have kind of endeavoured to do this very radical kind of film programming that was supported by the Rio, because at that time it was set up as a community cinema, so that was the kind of the remit. So yeah, I mean, it's very different from your own experience. But as I go on, because I'm not only going to be researching the Rio, I'm going to be moving on to different archives. That might become a bit more troubling, I'm not sure.
So did you fall in love with the Women of Colour Index? Was that how it worked for you?
Yeah, it was quite a similar kind of journey as in to how it's been described, working with an archive, how you come across one bit of information and then you realise you want to find out why. It opens a whole bunch of can of worms. and makes you sort of research one archive, and then you end up going and finding books or wondering where these artists are. Where, you know, a lot of the stuff that I started doing straight away was Google searching a lot of the artists that I came across in the index. And then a lot of these women never came up on Google, even some of them who are around. And even one of the most sort of popular artists in the index, I'd say there's a very limited amount of work by her on Google. And so that just was quite eye-opening, because I wouldn't say Google has everything on it, but these days you can find out quite a lot of information, especially about very mainstream artists. Then I think it just hit home that this, you know, as an artist myself who's been to art school and has been trying to work as an artist and a designer, it became very clear that the discriminations that I faced and I see other women of colour facing, it wasn't an accident. These are very systematic problems that are really visible in the archive, how our histories are documented and hidden away and then silenced. I mean, you know, it just felt like a really big responsibility to work with the archive.
Well, was to kind of discover other things. So when you're working with the reading groups, the piece of paper is more of a sparking off, you know, the bit of archive that you look at in detail is something that starts off something else. Is that right?
So you mean when we talk, when we sort of choose a text normally, we normally just choose a text from the archive, and this is how a reading group session would start off. And there's a lot of writing by the artist, or it's either by the artist or it's somebody who's written about them. So yeah, that kind of hits the kind of main conversation, but then we try to look at the artwork, and that also branches outside the archive, as you know, I think we've looked at other slides that are in other places.
Does anybody in the audience have a question about how? Oh, here we go. I think this is friend Selena. If this is being recorded, do you want people to identify you?
There's no need. We can hear the question. We're not going to film anybody in the audience.
I have a question for Julia. Thanks a lot for your film. But I have a question because in a documentary about Austrian archive, you chose to narrate it in English. And I kind of would like to ask about that. And I'm asking, do you think that it's more suitable for non-German speaking audiences? And also, following from that, do you think that given Austria's history and involvement with Nazism, do you think that the film is still controversial in Austria now? That when people watch it, they don't like it? You mentioned before that it wasn't accepted for a festival. Do you think this might be the part? Thank you.
Okay, so we made the film in 3 languages. One is German, one is English, one is Spanish. The Spanish is a little bit... It comes from the fact that Nina is based in Mexico City. This is also the reason why she's unfortunately not here today. And we already showed it in Mexico City, the film. But of course, I would say the most for us, like when we started to make the movie, our first target audience was of course like the feminist art scene in Vienna and in Austria, because this is the community that is affected by what was happening in history the most, I would say. And then from the reactions that we got, I mean, we started out our first idea how to work with that archive was not necessarily a movie, but we started out making lecture performances, and then finally decided that it might be more economic to make a film out of it, and also to kind of have it as something that maybe also finds its way into other archives, let's say it like this. And when we were doing these lecture performances, we had very weird, or for us surprising and weird reactions partly to it. Like we had were at the conference with the lecture performance where we had like one other woman from Austria, like she works in the radio, and she was very upset by our idea that there could have been some sort of continuities up until the 70s within an Austrian art organization, and even though we thought that's not a big deal, I mean, it comes out of history, and it's clear that something like this happens. For her, it was a big scandal that we had this idea. So that was one of the reactions. And up until now, we did not, funnily, we did not have any opportunities to show the film in Austria in the cinemas.
Thanks. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, who just introduced your PhD. Selina. I just want to ask why you use the word queer in relation to our histories, which wasn't actually a common word that was used through the 80s.
I think for me, it's more of an approach for a methodology. So when I'm talking about queer, I'm talking about all aspects of sexuality. So obviously lesbian definition, but there's gay, bisexual, transgender. So for me, I guess, when I did my undergraduate degree, queer theory was obviously something that was very important for me. So that I'm sort of implanting that within my own kind of research, but that doesn't mean at all that I'm erasing, lesbian identity at all. And I'm actually wrestling with it myself and thinking about redefining my kind of terminology. But that's something that I'm kind of thinking through. Yeah. Thanks for bringing it up.
It is quite. Yeah, it's problematic for me anyway.
No, I understand.
And the other thing was, I just wanted to make a comment on section 28, which, yes, was about homosexuality. But actually, for those of us who were lesbians with young children in schools, we were incredibly affected, and teachers were incredibly affected who had children who were lesbians. And because the overriding structure for us was we weren't allowed. We were considered a pretended family, and it was incredibly difficult. So I think that would be useful to put in, as well as about homosexuality.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, by the way, thank you very much. I found it really interesting, and also the...
Did you come to the Rio during these times?
Yes.
I can talk to you after.
Got time for one more question? Oh God, I've got two. There's one in that corner too.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your film, and thank you for your presentation. It's not so much a question, it's just an appeal to please people keep archiving and keep recording history. I'm here from Leeds, from an animation workshop which has been a women's collective, and next year's our 40th anniversary. I'm 68, I'm not going to last much longer. We've got loads of stuff. All right, maybe just another 20 years or so, but it's not, it's becoming too big a job for me on my own to archive our stuff. And it's the same for all of us who've been doing feminist filmmaking for a very long time. A lot of us have got a lot of stuff, and we need support in trying to work out what to do with it, because not only our archive consists not only of our films, not only of the negs of our films, but also of the documentation relating to our films. The history of the women's movement is buried in our invoice books and our distribution records. Not only the women's movement, but also the lesbian and gay rights movement, the trade union movement. There's loads of history in there, and we're really struggling to find ways to record it for people in the future, so that women who come along in another 20 years won't think, as we did, that we were the first women ever making animated films because there was no history about it. Thank you.
I think that's so important, and that's a terrific thing to end on. We should be networking, actually, and if you want to email me for advice on what to do and where to go for funding, because of course at this point we need to make the people who have money aware that there are these archives out there that have to be preserved for the future. Anyway, thank you very much.
Points of information.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is really
The Feminist Library.
I'm from the Feminist Library in London, but also Cathy here and other people around are from the Feminist and Women's Libraries Archives Network, which we've recently set up. And the Leeds Animation Workshop is in Leeds, where the Feminist Archives North is. And yeah, I completely agree, we totally need all to get together and yeah. You can talk to, there's half a dozen of us here I can see, that you should kind of just have a chat with so that we can indeed preserve all our material.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you.